It gives a good sense of the size. Okay.
They're smaller than. You're smaller even than but I the big guys I see on the camera earlier.
Oh, really? The ones you're finding now? Yeah. Piece of seal.
Should I move over a little bit? Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Want me to do an introduction?
Or I can do it, whichever you like. You want to do?
Totally up to you. It'll be brief, but
Yeah.
okay.
And I'll. I can fill in.
Trevor, where should I be to give an intro? Okay, well then we won't worry about the intro. You go.
I'll stand next to you.
Yeah. I'm going to talk into John's mic so people online can hear us. Thanks everybody for being here. We are so happy today to have John Calambokidis and Hannah from Cascadia Research Collective to give us an update on the Sounders gray whales and some of the most recent research that they've been doing. So we're really excited. Thank you so much for being here.
Really nice to see all of you again, and it's great for us to come up here. Each year, it's of course right during the prime of the gray whale season, and we usually find a way to fit it in nicely with our work, and that's worked out well today. We were able to do a little partial survey. John Durbin and Holly Fernbach are actually out. We were able to get leads on a few whales to send them to get measurements, and then we have to not delay too much because then we have to get Hannah and Maya to their intertidal sampling site to sample some of the areas that the gray whales are feeding. So I was going to talk, kind of have a little bit of material on the new research and new results from this year, but also a little bit of background on gray whales for those of you that are new. I recognize quite a few of you, so I know a lot of you are well experienced. So it'll be a little bit new and a little bit of the familiar stuff. I actually added some of the new slides to a talk I did just a month ago, just talking about, you know, the changed perspective on gray whales. So some of the way this slideshow goes is how both for me and I think a lot of other scientists, gray whales went from a species we, you know, thought we understood, sometimes treated as, you know, one of the more primitive gray whales, highly specialized in how it feeds, having a very regimented migration pattern between these breeding lagoons in Mexico and feeding areas up in the Arctic. And instead, what we found out is they're far more complicated, far more varied. And some of that is going to, I think, benefit them, especially in dealing with some of the changing challenges that they're facing in the ocean today. So part of my talk will be to talk about some of those changing challenges and also some of the variety of wider variety of strategies gray whales have used throughout their range to survive and prosper, and evolve over these hundreds of thousands of years. And actually, maybe before I move on, I'll back up one. Quite a few of the collaborators that we have at Cascadia that work on different elements of this work. Jessie Huggins, for example, is our stranding coordinator. I think she's dealing with a stranded gray whale. There have been a couple in the last week that have come up, and this has been a very busy time for her over the last recent years with the elevated number of strandings that I'll talk about. Some of our other field researchers involved in surveying up here or in the tag deployments. Hannah, who I'll introduce in more detail later, Alex and Ali that do a lot of our photo ID work with gray whales. And then I also include John Durbin and Holly Fernbaugh, who are our key partners looking at the health condition of gray whales. Now, overall, gray whales make this migration from Baja to the Arctic. I'm going to talk about gray whales, maybe breaking them into 4 groups for now. We're going to end up focusing on one of those. But there's the overall Eastern North Pacific gray whale population, and that's the one that makes the classic migration from Mexico up to the Arctic area shown in red. There's another group that we call the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. This is shown in green here. That's an area that a group of what we've identified, and I'll show you their population trends numbers, a little over 200 individuals compared to the closer to 15 to 20,000 of the overall Eastern North Pacific gray whale population. And that group of the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, I think we need a catchier name. I really like that we've come up with a Sounders name for these local gray whales. We need a catchier name for the Pacific Coast Feeding Group because we just end up saying PCFG because it's too much. That group there was first discovered really by Jim Darling and some early work on Vancouver Island in the 1970s, but it had been noted going back much further in time, early explorers and some of the early discoveries on gray whales that they would see gray whales along the coast of Northern California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia into summer months, that period when in theory they'd be in the Arctic. And what Jim's work and then the work we followed up on starting in the early 1980s at Cascadia was finding out that that was a stable group of whales. It wasn't just part of the Eastern North Pacific gray whale population that had briefly stopped to feed. It actually was a distinct group with the same animals returning year to year. Genetic studies, both on the US side, led by Amy Lang, on the Canadian side by Tim Fraser and Jim Darling, showed that actually the haplotype mix and the mitochondrial DNA of these PCFG gray whales statistically is significantly different than those that feed in Alaska, meaning they had enough stability and there wasn't so much interchange across those two groups to make their haplotype patterns be equivalent. We see some interchange between those groups, so it's not like they're completely separate, and they do interbreed in Mexico as well. The PCFG gray whales are seen down into Mexican waters and interbreed with that overall Eastern North Pacific population. But that mitochondrial DNA really represents the transfer of DNA maternally from the mother to her offspring. And it represents different, basically, maternal lineages and reflects the fact that mothers tend to take their calves to the area they feed. Those calves end up adopting that area. And that's what kind of creates these somewhat distinct maternal lineages, if you will. So that was group 2. And I'll be talking about these in a little more depth later. Then there's a Western North Pacific population. It was much larger. It was heavily hunted. Gray whales have gone through being hunted through all the different eras of whaling, going back to traditional native Aboriginal whaling, to the early days of commercial whaling and Yankee whaling, to the modern era of commercial whaling. They were hunted through all of those different periods, partly because they were so accessible, migrating near shore and having these distinct, especially breeding areas in Mexico that whalers could target. And then the group you're going to hear the most about that I'm going to focus on are the Sounders gray whales, which is this little inset box. I really like that name. It's stuck now. For a while, we used to call them Northern Puget Sound residents or something like that. And these are whales that are largely part of that larger eastern North Pacific population that stop off and feed for what would traditionally we would say would be 2 to 3 months. But as I'll show you, there are lots of examples of them staying much longer than that. And that kind of general pattern has held true, but there are many, many more exceptions. And again, we'll look at this. This is just the same information I just talked about, except in 4 different columns here. For the overall Eastern North Pacific, sounders that are a part of it, the Pacific Coast Feeding Group that's somewhat distinct, in Western gray whales. Now, the overall Eastern North Pacific gray whale population has gone through a very recent unusual mortality event. And that's sort of a term NOAA uses and designates. That unusual mortality event was first designated in 2019 as we started to notice elevated levels of strandings. And over here in the left-hand corner, you can see some of the typical numbers of strandings that occur along the entire range and how it took a big jump. But I'm going to show you in a second a much longer term trend based on the Washington data, where we have more 30, 40 years of data. It can show you how much more dramatic the increase in these strandings were during this 2019 to 2023 period for this unusual mortality event. But this was designated by NOAA in 2019 and just agreed to have been lifted at the end of 2023. And it was just it was revealed a few months ago, but it actually was effectively in November 2023 that unusual mortality event was lifted. During that period, you can see close to 700 dead gray whales were found. We think that likely represents only something in the neighborhood of 15, 20% of the true number that die. And we know that because a lot of the gray whales that die, a lot of the whales overall that die, don't wash up on a beach to be discovered. They sink and aren't discovered. But with gray whales, I'll show you some of the data we have on how that Eastern North Pacific population is doing. And you can actually see the effect of this mortality, and then it was much larger than that body count that we documented. On the right, that map shows you all the locations that gray whales were found dead during that 2019 to 2023 period. And you can see it covers the whole range of gray whales, from their breeding areas in Mexico all the way up to their feeding areas in Alaska. And we probably have a pretty high proportion of the strandings in Washington, partly because our shores are accessible and we can measure it more. It's probably most undercounted in Alaska, an area where even if whales washed up, they might not be discovered. Okay, I mentioned that we have a really good picture of how these unusual mortality events have affected gray whales. And part of this was summarized in a recent paper in Science that Josh Stewart was the senior author on, and that we were involved with, that looked at the overall gray whale population dynamics. And I'll have some slightly larger slides of this later, but the top figure at the top right there shows you these trends, and you can notice some pretty dramatic up and down changes in the abundance of gray whales. And those numbers that maybe you'll see it when it's on a bigger slide, but it maybe doesn't quite give justice to the fact some of those dips are the loss of thousands of whales to the population. And so it gave a sense of that population size. What this paper did was tried to link the stranding data, the population count data, the reproductive data, some of the health assessment data, some of the prey data in the Arctic, all together into one model. And that was the main conclusion of kind of linking those things and the main insight that paper provided. And the fact that it does look like gray whales go through these boom and bust cycles in their overall feedings. A couple of points I want to make about the unusual mortality event is that immediately prior to it, in the late 2010s, the Eastern North Pacific gray whale population was at record numbers. One of the previous estimates was over 25,000. So those probably were numbers that seemed to even exceed some of the estimates of the number of gray whales that existed prior to commercial whaling. So it was doing extremely well. It was considered one of the great success stories of whales recovering from whaling. Part of the concern about the decline in gray whales is the fact that in the Arctic, there are dramatic environmental changes occurring with climate change and decreases in ice cover. Uh, it was at least tempting initially to try to link, oh, loss of ice, that must be causing this unusual mortality event. But that turns out to be a very complicated question. In previous research, it had actually been found that in years there was lower ice cover because that varied from year to year, in addition to the underlying trend of warming Arctic and decreasing ice, there are up and down years. And in past research, years where there was less ice in the Arctic, gray whales actually did better and produced more calves in the following year. So there were ways that low ice benefited gray whales. And one of the clear ways that benefited gray whales was it opened up areas they could access sooner in the year, and they could get to certain habitats they couldn't get to before. But that's just a short-term phenomenon. What is the long-term effect of decreasing ice on the productivity that might affect their overall prey base up there? That's a bigger question. Gray whales did go through a previous declared unusual mortality event in 1999, 2000, and they did not only fully recover from that, but even exceed what it was before that. So those were reasons why there was some hope about, not being too dire about the current unusual mortality event. Okay, I'm going to focus in. I mentioned the strandings in Washington State. We have this much more detailed graph. I presented this at past Welcome to the Whales talks, but now we have additional years of data on here. And for Washington State, our strandings primarily occur in these months from April through June. So those are our peak periods of mortality. So there's a very strong seasonal cycle. And when we see these dead gray whales in Washington, that matches sort of the period right after the peak of their migration timing through the area. So it makes sense. That's when gray whales would be coming through. It makes sense that it's occurring during that northbound migration because that's right at the end of when they've gone through a seasonal fast. So that's when they'd be most stressed due to any nutritional shortage they had from the previous feeding season. So that season pattern made a lot of sense. Now, if you look at this annual pattern, you can see in most years, we're typically getting around 4 to 8 dead gray whales that we discover in Washington State each year. But you can see some big spikes, and the spikes seem to center around 3 periods. This is our most recent unusual mortality event. Big spike in 2019 there, and then it's been above normal, you can see, for the following years, but much lower than that 2019 year. And that kind of matches the finding with the unusual mortality event, that it is something that hit the population hard in 2019. And then it kept affecting it, but not quite as dramatically in the subsequent years. Here's that other unusual mortality event I mentioned, 1999, 2000. And you can see in those 2 years, we had 50 strandings combined between the 2 years. So no one year was as high as what 2019 was, but the 2 years together were the highest pair of years we had ever seen for gray whale mortalities. And that matched that.
Stranding is a dead whale.
Pretty much for all of this, I'm all talking about whales that either washed up dead or came ashore alive and died. So these are all end up being dead whales, though in a few cases they're alive. I do want to highlight something that ends up being interesting, and I've highlighted this period 1990-91, and that's the next highest pair of years for gray whale mortality in Washington. Not quite as high as the other years, but it was it was noticeably higher and above average. There were 10 or more whales. It's the only other pair of years with 10 or more whales that stranded, and that's going to come back. It wasn't a declared unusual mortality event, but that ends up playing into our story of the sounders. Very important. Many of these whales that wash up are really emaciated in these unusual mortality event years, but that also holds for some of the non-unusual mortality event years. A lot of the whales end up looking very skinny, very emaciated. When you cut open, they have a defined blubber layer like you see on the right there, but that blubber layer is often either watery or very dry and with very little oil in it. When we tested for lipid content on that blubber, It's often under 5% lipids in the blubber, and sometimes even lower than that. So even though they still have a blubber layer, it may seem odd that they were still basically starved to death and had used up all of the lipids in their body. And especially the fat inside their body they end up having this very kind of sharply angled body shape rather than rotund. And this can get tricky because if a whale washes up dead, usually within a matter of days, and if it dies and floats, it's going to start bloating and it'll kind of hide that. And it isn't until you open it up that you see that phenomenon. And it's also apparent sometimes in some of these live whales that you see. This is the head of a live whale, and you can see this very angular back around the spinal column that's very abnormal for that. We do get other causes of death of gray whales that occur not just in non-UME years, but UME years. That includes kind of a growing issue of entanglement and finding whales that have gotten entangled. We have ship strikes. We have whales that sometimes live strand and have evidence of having been attacked by killer whales. There's an interplay among some of those factors. In some of the UME years, we actually think that there are whales that are lingering and going into areas searching for food, and more likely that either be vulnerable to ship strike or become entangled and go into areas where there's more human activity. So there's an interplay between some of these factors. Just starting in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen increasing evidence of killer whale attacks on gray whales that have occurred, and that played a role in 21 and 22. We had almost a third of the killer whales had at least signs of having been preyed on by killer whales. The size class of the gray whales that have died, you see a definite what we call a bimodal distribution, which is this area here is animals that would be in the yearling kind of young class, and then out here these are older animals. And the color codes show the proportion male and female. And here you see an interesting thing, like in this next to largest size class, you see a preponderance of males. And then in these largest size classes, you see a preponderance of females. And that reflects the fact that gray whales, like other baleen whales, the females are slightly larger. So those are probably all adult animals, but you see that evidence of that sexual dimorphism that exists between male and female gray whales. Okay, I think I'm going to skip this slide. I think I've been making some of those points. I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to mention that we are very much working where whales become entangled to both document that and engage in disentanglements. This was a gray whale we disentangled from Dungeness crab gear in 2020. It's something that we're trying to work with a variety of large whale species, not just gray whales, and expand up and down the West Coast. We're within in the next month, we're going to announce something we're calling the Partnership for West Coast Whale Entanglement Action. Some of you may have known Jen Tackaberry and Doug Sandilands that used to work in the Pacific Northwest. Cascadia, we're bringing them back and hiring them full time to help lead that and try to get more successful efforts to both document entanglements, conduct trainings and education on that, and also do these types of disentanglements that should help these whales. Sorry, I'm hitting the wrong button there. My bad. I think I'm going to skip this. Okay, now we're going to the Sounders gray whales and that I'm mostly going to focus on some of the update on our iconic Sounder gray whale, Patch. We gave it the number 49. It was actually the 49th individual gray whale we had identified. Now we're we're over 2,500 in the numbers that we're assigning. And he was first identified in 1991. The Sounders gray whales are kind of known for this shallow water feeding on ghost shrimp beds that many of you know about. We've studied them many different ways. I'm really excited to hear and see what Hannah's going to tell you about some of the studies of prey in the past. We've noticed some of these feeding pits, and they're even visible on Google Earth, and documented the feeding pits. This is Google Earth images in this case, where these little dimples are the pits made by feeding gray whales. And this is actually a Google Earth map where a dot has been placed on every one of the feeding pits across the different images. And there's like 20,000 of them there where we've documented feeding pits on Google Earth. I won't go into too much detail on that. And now I'm kind of getting into the update thing. And these are just some of the collaborative projects we have going on with the Sounders gray whales. You're going to hear about Hannah's work focusing on energetics and feeding of the sounders, as well as some work she's done with vocal behavior. We've been doing increased numbers of deployments of suction cup attached multi-sensor video tags, which we actually just did in the last week, and I'll give you just a brief summary of that. Going on today is some of this health assessment work. I'll show you a little summary of that. We have a project by a master's student at Evergreen, Alex Pavlinovich, that is now in review in a journal looking at interactions between Sounders gray whales and some of the vessels in this area, working off Hat Island. Analysis of feeding pits. Amanda Ruido, who's doing a master's at Evergreen and working with Hannah, is now working with some of the aerial photographs that have been gathered going back to 2008, thanks largely to Fred piloting the plane and people like Julia Erickson, who have flown and documented these on some of these flights, the feeding pits that exist. We're also doing some other work. We have another manuscript currently submitted and in review by Kira Telford, another graduate student, looking at ways to measure body condition from boat-based photographs, not just the drone images. I did want to mention, and I'll show one slide, that in March, just last month, we had a paper come out that identified what we call biologically important feeding areas for gray whales up and down the coast, and that included a slightly expanded designation for the Sounders gray whales. I'll show you just a little bit of that. Any of you who have heard my talk have seen this figure before. This is the one we update. It shows different individuals by row. Columns are years. If it's in green or highlighted in any color, it means we saw the whale that year. If it's transparent or this gray color, it means we didn't document it that year. In some cases, it may mean the gray whale was there and we might not have encountered it, or maybe it was there for a short time. And that's especially true for these early years. You see a lot more kind of missing spots in these early years because that's before when we were maybe doing just a couple of surveys each spring, and before there was whale watching for the Sounders gray whales, so we didn't get a lot of opportunistic sighting, or before the Whale Center and Whale Museum and the huge attention residents on Whidbey Island and Camano Island have come to now pay to this group of gray whales. So I'm going to focus on the very right end, which is the beginning of filling in the 2024 year. And I'll draw a couple of things. If you've seen my talks before, you'll notice that the original Sounder gray whales, of which there were 6, were first documented in 1990-91. And then you'll see in 1999 and 2000, another 6 gray whales joined them, because those were the rows going down. And then you can see in 2018 and 19, another 8 gray whales ended up joining the Sounders. And we're defining the Sounders as gray whales that have been seen in this area in multiple years. That's our definition for them. And if you hearken back, and I think I've got a figure that puts these together, but you may remember 1990-91, 1999-2000, and 2019 as the 3 periods of elevated gray whale mortality. The latter 2 being declared UME events, this other one being the other one I highlighted. So it really ended up providing over time a perspective that these Sounders gray whales were coming here in years of high nutritional stress. And that's when they were discovering this area, and new whales joined the Sounders. And then once they discovered it, they kept returning. So that's our kind of overall insight. If we look at where we're at, we got up to about 20 Sounders gray whales. But you can see in our last year here, 2024, and we're not all the way through the season yet, there are these ones in red here. I should have clarified. These, I put in red these 2 whales, and it's Dubnuck and Patch. have not been seen. They've been some of the most regular whales. And so it's in red because they're presumed dead. And in fact, Dubnuck, one of them, we last saw looking in really poor body condition. And so it sort of fits with that. You'll see a number of other whales we have not seen yet this year. Going from Shackleton, whale, 21 we haven't seen yet. We haven't seen whale 185 yet. We haven't seen 723 Lucifer. There are a number of missing ones, but it's still, we're only partway through the season. So it's a little premature to judge that. Right now, we're up to 11 different sounder gray whales have been identified so far this season. There's at least one new whale that doesn't match any of our photographs that's also kicking around with them, but that could change today. Okay, let's see. I think I kind of, on this slide, I just want to make the point that in this most recent unusual mortality event since 2019, in addition to seeing more of these whales join this sounders group, we've also seen increasing out of season and longer duration stays by gray whales. For example, in different years, including 2022, 23, and 24, we've had different combinations of at least 2 sounder gray whales foregoing the migration down to Mexico, which typically they would do from December through February before they showed up here, who have been present December, January, February in this area, and apparently foregoed migrating to Mexico and going to the normal breeding areas. So that was one change we've seen. We had at least one whale, 2440, that was seen across, a 15-month period and stayed in this area feeding. Didn't go north and stayed in feeding almost continuously. Okay. These were the 2 whales I mentioned that have disappeared that were 2 of the favorites. I'm hoping we're not adding Shackleton, whale 21, to that list. Usually he's shown up by now. And this is just that link I already made for you. The circled periods of high mortality. Here you can see shaded in the background the number of new sounders either discovered or joining. And you'll see these lightly shaded bars exactly line up with those periods of elevated mortality. And then if you translate that up here, this is now showing the overall population trend of gray whales. And you'll see 3 periods of major declines in the population documented with the counts. And those exactly line up with those 3 periods as well. So it kind of puts those 3 things I've been talking about just together. Also during years of high mortality, we also tend to see more sightings of gray whales showing up in what we call unusual areas, areas where there's not gray whale prey, where we don't typically see gray whales, and that goes up. And there's a significant correlation between the number of strandings and number of these sightings in unusual areas that also occur. Yes. Well, I view it as that there's uncertainty at a minimum of their food in the Arctic. So if you have uncertainty and if you're under nutritional stress and things are good here, you're more likely to want to stay and maybe forego going north or forego going south for the fact of staying here longer. Whereas it used to be purely just a stopover spot. Maybe it's worth doing that more if other areas aren't as promising. So that's, well, those ones that didn't go to Mexico would be potentially foregoing some options of breeding. I mentioned the kind of high resolution photogrammetry that John Durbin and Holly Firmbaugh with SR3 are doing, and they're out there doing that today. That's, ends up providing these high resolution vertical photographs, and they use a relationship between length and the width of the animals in those photographs to measure body condition and come up with a width to length ratio. And it very clearly, I'm not going to go into details, but on any of these, you see these are sets of lines connecting the multiple measurements of the body condition of different individuals by Julian day. So it's measuring it through the season. And you can see that it's generally an upward trend. The animals visibly gain body condition over time. And this is the same individual in these photographs here. In February, when it first arrived, very skinny. By April, and we knew there was some good prey and benefit these whales were getting, but that they would change that dramatically, that quickly, was surprising. To me, it was surprising to John and Holly in their work to see how they do improve. And that isn't true for the experienced animals. Seem to do this. They did. This is the same individual going from March to May, and it was an example. It's in the black line right here of an individual that did not improve in body condition. So there are some animals, maybe they don't know how to take advantage of this feeding thing. And as Hannah talks about how these whales feed, you'll get a picture. This is something that requires maybe some experience to know how to do. Either experience or willingness to follow the lead of the experienced whales of knowing when to go into these shallow water intertidal areas. I generally refer to this as high risk feeding strategy. And from the tag data, we can kind of see that it can take a lot. We do get to measure some of these whales over across different years. This is Shackleton, one of our missing whales. We really want to add 2024 to this picture, but you can see we have the same individual across years. We can look at how that changes year to year. We've also been able to, in at least 2 animals, detect when they appear to be pregnant, even though that pregnancy would be pretty early on in their gestation period when they're here. It still was detectable mostly by seeing this is a male, the girthiest part being here on this animal, and in these 2 animals that were judged to be pregnant, it's further back on the body. Yes. Well, we would expect that, that when they're down on their breeding grounds, that it would generally be kind of January, February, that they would be both getting pregnant, and then the following year, so a 1-year gestation, that they would be giving birth. In that, there's some wrinkles to that, but that's, in summary, it's a year-long pattern. Okay, and we don't have a ton of examples of that because the majority of the sounders are male. So we only have a few females. We've never seen any of the females bring their calf to this area, but in some of these years where we've either suspected or documented that they either had a calf or were pregnant, we generally don't see them in the year they would have the calf. There's one exception to that where we suspect the whale showed up after a year we thought it was pregnant, and it did not have a calf. It was likely a year it lost its calf. Okay. Let's see, just so far this year, this slide is already out of date. Through yesterday, they had done 3 of their photogrammetry surveys. It's now 4 because they're doing one today. So far, at least through those first 3 surveys, they've gotten good body condition measurements of 8 of the whales. 4 of them they've been able to measure in multiple surveys. Now, across all the different years, they actually have 24 different whales. They've included some of those straggler whales that they've gotten measurements of, with 18 of them in multiple years. So that study is going really well. These are some of the photographs they just sent me yesterday from their surveys this year, showing some of the individuals that we have that are around. Some of these, like this one here, shows one individual, 2259, that already shows it's getting girthier just across their first 2 surveys in mid-March and April 1st. So that's just 2 weeks apart. But if you look at that, you can already see some improvement in that whale. This is one of the new sounders. So it looks like it's figured out how to make good feeding. And if I go back to this slide, this whale here, kind of get a little mental image of this whale, because I'm going to show a little bit of video that Hannah got of this particular individual just a few days ago. And you can see how dramatically different it looks than in that image there. Okay. These are all drone-based photographs. Okay, so I mentioned that one individual, 2249. So this is that individual here. I'll just play this a little bit. So this Hannah took from Mission Beach on April 10th, so a few days ago. And I don't know if you remember from that previous image, this was a very skinny whale. does not look so skinny anymore. And this is it engaged in feeding off of Mission Beach. Hannah was very excited to get this. This is one of her study sites that she'll refer to. Yes, well, that is a really good question. and and one of the exciting things and why Hannah's dissertation is so powerful is, there's no other baleen whale where we could actually measure how much they eat, but we actually have the potential to do that with gray whales. Between what we know about how often they feed from the tag data, and I'll show you an example of that. We know how many times they're creating these feeding pits. And Hannah's work sampling the pits and looking at how much prey was removed, we can actually calculate how much they're eating. So it's actually something we can do that isn't really possible with most baleen whales. And then with these vertical drone-based photographs, we can see how that affects body condition and how that change occurs. So all of that, is going to be put together. Okay, I'm going to skip a few more. Maybe I'll contrast. This is how we used to deploy tags on gray whales, and up until just last year, these are these small suction cup attached tags. This is an earlier version of a tag created by Custom Animal Tracking Solution, CATS. We now use a slightly different version, but here's how we used to deploy it. Here with this video running on the left, you'll see someone with a crossbow. This is actually a child's crossbow, and it's a dart that will be fired on tagging, and this bounces off the whale and takes a piece of skin. So we have a bow pulpit on our boat. This is kind of coming up slowly behind the whale. Unfortunately, I didn't clean my camera. This is taken from my position driving, but we kind of time the approach, and that he slaps it on and gets the biopsy. So that's the old way we used to do it. Now we're using these drones. We started doing this for the first time last year. This is a technique developed by Ocean Alliance, who have partnered with us on doing these drone deployments. They've now done this with 6 different whale species. These are the first deployments done on gray whales. And this is dropping. Here's the drone, dropping the drone onto the whale. And this is the image of it occurring. And I'll show you something, some of the recent ones we just did. So this is now taken from the drone. It hovers kind of behind the whale. You can see the tag is suspended from the drone, and then this drops onto the whale, and the suction cups attached. Well, it's funny you say that. Let's see. On this left photo here, this is actually Earhart right after we tagged her and did this sort of half spy hop right there. And I managed to get a photo. It almost seemed like looking up at the drone, like, where did that come from? On that. And then this is one of the deployments this year. Now, one thing, so far in this year, in 3 days between 7 and 10 April, we did 11 deployments on 7 different whales. So it worked out really well. That was more successful. We're going to repeat that. What we're doing differently this year is we're going to repeat that again in 3 weeks. And we want to see if are there changes on some of the tag related data that we get between early and late in the season. We hadn't really looked at those 2 different time periods before. How long do they stay on? Generally hours to the longest deployment we have. Hannah's maybe hours away from telling us when it came off, but the longest deployment in previous years we had went 67 hours. So you can get up to a few days. And that at that time was a record for these suction cup tags. And we discovered from some of the video they gathered that probably that record was achieved because whales were often making contact with each other, and the tag was getting pressed back on. And if you've been to previous talks, I used to show video of that. I don't think I have it in this talk, but I don't think we'll show it here. I will point out that, like one of our goals and one thing we've been able to do with these deployments with the drone drops that we haven't been able to before is these are 3 whales on 10 April, and each one has a tag on it. We've been able to get all the different individuals in the group with a tag. So in this case, we're able to track all of them. That actually, for us, was really important because there's a bit of an uncertainty in the research community in how, when we measure vocalizations heard on these tags, because more and more there's remote acoustic monitoring, using hydrophones of whales. But we need to know a little bit more about, which whales and how often they produce vocalizations. And these tags can tell us that. But on the tag, you hear a vocalization and you don't know if it's being produced by the animal that's tagged, or it could be any of the animals really close to it. It would be a loud call. Either way, there's a hint that sometimes the calls are detected by vibrations on the accelerometer on the tag. But we wanted to try to nail down, is every call produced by that whale detected on the accelerometer? And does the accelerometer never, vibrate and pick up the call of a neighboring whale, even if it's right next to it? And by getting tags on all 3 whales, for the first time, we'll have the ability to do that. Because in theory, you'd acoustically hear any call loudly on all 3. And in theory, you'd only see it on the accelerometer on 1. If you see it on 0, it might tell you, well, maybe it's a little more dependent on tag placement, and it doesn't always get picked up on the accelerometer. If you hear it on 2, it tells you, well, maybe it's only detecting it when it's really loud, and it doesn't matter if it's on. So we're hoping to answer that, and we're excited about that finding. Okay, I think I'm running a little long here. I think I skipped one slide I was going to maybe show. With the tags, yes. Well, there are actually all the different sensors include depth and pressure, temperature, acoustics, accelerometry, magnetometry. What else am I forgetting? Yes. And then video only occasionally. The video, you can only record up to a few hours of video. The tags have a built-in GPS that doesn't work very well. So some of the tags have an added GPS that gives us very precise movement position data. But to get that accurately, we actually have to add a little fast lock GPS to the tag to do that. I'm going to do a quick check-in. How are we on time? Half hour. I don't want by 2:30. Okay, that's good. I just want to make sure I don't cut out Hannah's time. Okay, I'm going to skip this right now. I will say one discovery we did have this with the drone deployments. Last year we did drone and tag and pole deployments, and the drone deployments tended to be shorter than the ones we did with pole, which would make sense when you're just kind of dropping a tag. Are all 4 suction cups going to land exactly flat? Are they going to hit with equal pressure compared to when you press it on with a pole? And so we noticed that on average, the drone deployments were about half as long as the pole deployments. But the last set of deployments we did lasted the longest. And I kind of noticed it in my mind, but I didn't pay attention. But Chris with Ocean Alliance, who was doing the deployments, pointed out he had actually doubled the elevation he was dropping the tags from. And so they were dropping from further and probably sticking better. So that was a good discovery. Okay. Maybe a little higher risk of damage to the tag. We get nervous. Like it looks pretty innocent in the video, but we would be really scared to take one of our tags and hold it that height and just drop it on the floor. I mean, that would be really scary. We would never think to do that, but it's sort of what we're doing. Yes, we have to recover them. They also have a VHF transmitter and a satellite transmitter. The satellite transmitter gives us kind of some information sometimes on when the tag is off. And since it goes to a satellite, it can occur anywhere. The tag is designed so it floats with both of those antennas out of the water. So we know when it goes from being on the whale to floating. Both the VHF will now hear constantly, and now it'll start to get good satellite positions. So we can tell when it's off the whale, get a rough location, and then we use a very old technology, a directional Yagi antenna, to home in on the tag to recover it in the water, but that only has a range of about 10 miles. I don't think I'll belabor this. This is just showing that these whales feed for short periods of time. This is the roll sensor on the tag showing when the whale is rolled 90 degrees on its right side, and it lines up with the high tide periods. We had wondered if these gray whales had fed at other times, and it really looks like they're really targeting the high tide periods when they're feeding in that intertidal area. No, they pretty much roll only right. And in other species with larger sample sizes, it's a small percent. Hannah probably knows the percent. I want to say it's 10 or 20% left-handed, 10 to 15% left-handed, kind of not that different from humans. Okay, I'm not going to show these videos. These, if you've seen these before, they're available on Cascadia Research's YouTube channel. They show some of the feeding events, diving, some of the contact between whales. I'll just say there are lots of interesting things that occur that the video picks up on. Hannah has a paper now published on the acoustic behavior of the sounder gray whale, so I've just highlighted that here, and that's kind of a neat thing coming out of this work. Okay. I'm just going to go jump ahead here and just say the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. I had data on some of these other things, and I'll maybe just jump ahead and just show you that the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, we've been tracking. I've left the sounders. We've been tracking their abundance with mark recapture, and they don't show anywhere near the dramatic variations in that the overall abundance of eastern North Pacific gray whales have shown. So it shows you that these PCFG gray whales are reliant on a different prey base, not being affected by those things that were affecting the larger population. And they're actually doing, holding fairly stable. There's an online catalog of those whales. I mentioned that new paper on biologically important feeding areas of gray whales that just came out in Frontiers of Marine Science. And it does include both redefining the important migratory corridors for gray whales, but also the important feeding areas for PCFG gray whales. And this is our new map of the important feeding areas for the Sounders gray whales that we've identified and is now part of that assessment. Okay, with that, I am going to I'm going to switch to oh, what happened here? Interesting. I am going to switch to Hannah's presentation, and then we'll go back to sharing the screen, and then I'll introduce Hannah here. Yes. Well, so before we swap mics, though, this is Hannah. She's started working with us 3 years ago. She then ended up getting accepted to the PhD program at Stanford, working on the Goldbogen's lab. Really excited to have her. She was one of those people that just right from the word go impressed us. She was initially analyzing the vocal behavior of whales. I'd been looking for someone to really take on and dig into the energetics feeding part, and she was the right person to do it. And so I'll let her take over from that.
Kind of actually, I was at the first, my first Welcome the Wells, I think, was in 2020. So here I am 4 years later presenting. But thank you for that introduction, John. As he has highlighted and presented, the Sounders are really a unique opportunity to study a variety of different things in baleen whales. So not a whole lot is known about gray whales throughout their range when you're talking about foraging behavior, social dynamics, vocal behavior, energetics. A lot of this is still unknown, despite the fact that they're one of the most coastally proximate species. So any given moment, they're typically about 2 kilometers from shore. And even despite this, we know very little about them. So most of my work is focused on tag data, which John has already really covered. That's what I've spent the past 2 years. I'm in my second year of my PhD. So he covered that really well. I'm really just going to focus on the ghost shrimp themselves. Ghost shrimp are really fascinating organisms. They're actually ecosystem sentinels and keystone species as well. Anybody who has tried the walk on these tidal flats right outside of Langley knows that you sink very rapidly out there. So ghost shrimp actually can burrow up to 4 feet deep. They're bioturbators, so they churn over the sediment just because of their life histories. And then in really high densities, they can create this interesting interaction where they snuff out a lot of the shellfish species. So a lot of local organizations are interested in ghost shrimp because we have a very large aquaculture industry here in Washington Sound or Washington State, and in Willapa Bay, actually, they used a nerve agent, a pesticide to control ghost shrimp in the area because they're considered a pest and they can deplete the stocks. So feel free to ask me any questions as I go along. I only have a few slides. And how, okay, I'll do it. Is that okay? Okay, and to go back, I do what? 1 second. No. Okay. So one of the first things I want to talk about, I have a few different objectives. Really, I'm trying to measure prey displacement. I want to also get a measurement of the pits themselves. One of the other things we're looking at is how to quantify pit weathering over time. So how long do they stay out on the intertidal? And then I'm really interested in monitoring some of the ecological interactions. That video that John showed earlier of 2249 feeding, this was a so exciting moment for me. I don't know if you noticed, but that whale had a tag on it. And this was huge for me because it was a more direct link to where that whale is feeding. And then the next day, Maya and I were actually able to go out and sample those pits. So some of the stuff here, I utilize a volunteer network of recent sightings. So I have a few people kind of scattered around the area, and they report to me when they see, or I utilize Orca network sightings to figure out when whales are feeding and where. And then if it's in one of my locations, I can actually go and access those new pits on the first sufficiently low tide. And I have a vent tube valve action clam gun. I'm sure y'all are very familiar with this, but I select random points within that feeding pit and I pull those samples out. And then I also pull from around the pit. So what this gives me is a displacement ratio. So all this is how many shrimp are inside divided by how many shrimp are outside. And some very early preliminary results. That's why I'm asking that nobody take any photos. This is not published. So these values here, a value of 1 means that there was just as many shrimp on the outside as there were in. Values closer to 0 mean there were far less shrimp inside. And values over here on the right, or above 1, mean that there were more shrimp inside. So we've been able to this season, this is something that I just started doing this season, and we were able to sample, I think, 15 feeding pits over the past week. And you can see that these values are generally less than 0.5. So this means that the whales seem to be displacing at least half of the shrimp. Now, something that I should highlight here, these colors correlate with the age of the pit. So these 3 pits here, we actually sampled yesterday in Holmes Harbor, and these were 30 days old at least. These here are 2 weeks, 7 days, and then these brighter or darker purples here, those were the pits that we saw in the footage that whale 2249 creating, and then I was able to go out and sample those pits. So we're still doing a lot of collecting. These are just preliminary results. This is a project that Maya Green at Stanford University, an undergrad there, is helping me out with. And it's going to be part of the focus of her research thesis. All right. part of this prey displacement that I was talking about, and the measuring pits and being able to look at how pit density changes by site. I use a big drone, and what I'll do is I'll put it up. It uses multiple satellites to get really high precision positioning, and I can take several hundred photos, and then I use the software to stitch those all together. And this is the result here. So this is an orthomosaic of one of my locations, Mabana Shores. And this is really useful for being able to determine how old these pits were. You can see these are images that I took last year. So in March, about a month later, and then 2 weeks later. So you can see these kind of weathering. The software also enables me to measure these pits themselves, so I can measure volume and area and get an idea of the size of the pit. And all of this is really important, right, when you're trying to estimate how much prey this whale is consuming and how their body condition is improving over time, and getting into consumption. All right, another thing that I do, and currently, so last year I had 2 sites. The Tulalip tribe was great enough to allow me to come out to 2 of their locations. I sample at Spivada and Mission Beach, and if it weren't for them last year, I wouldn't have been able to collect shrimp at all because of some permitting processes. But we had 2 sites last year. I was able to sample between March and May, and then this kind of line transect method is just another objective that I have to try to figure out what is the distribution of shrimp in the Sound. Is it changing seasonally? Is it changing by year? And that's another thing that Maya is focusing on for her work. So this is important when you're trying to relate this back to you know, how much prey the whales are consuming themselves. So I utilize a point intercept line transect method, and what this means is I just set up meter by meter quadrats out there on the intertidal, and I take multiple pulls from those quadrats, and the idea is try to figure out, does the density of shrimp change along shore or vertically along the intertidal. I just want to give a shout out to, sorry, I keep on hitting this button. I want to give a shout out to Amanda Thomas. She's the Evergreen Master student looking at the aerial survey data. She's also been helping us do a lot of the sampling. This is pretty physically intensive work, but it's a ton of fun to be out there. We actually, a couple of our sites are pretty remote, so we'll have, I should have included an image, but I have a inflatable boat that we will pump up on the boat and then load up all of the equipment, including the drone and all of our sampling gear, and then we will walk that into the beach. I'm calling it an amphibious landing because I have a military background, but yeah, it's a lot of work. You sink. I also like to say that it's really fulfilling for me as a woman because it's the one time that I'm kind of at a benefit compared to my male colleagues, because I'm able to kind of walk around like a shorebird out there while they're sinking more like a seal, I would imagine. So yeah, so this is a photo. This was actually just taken yesterday in our Holmes Harbor location. We were able to do about 10 quadrats. And then we also record associated species, like there's a couple interesting fish species that'll have an interesting relationship with the shrimp. Either they'll predate on them. There's a goby species that predates on juvenile shrimp, or they like to inhabit their burrows as well. So we collect that information in hopes that someone down the line can utilize that. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not real knowledgeable in the use of pesticides and how that applies. I know that generally, anytime that someone proposes uses pesticides, there's a pretty good study, especially when you're looking at this kind of density, to determine if there's adverse effects to other shrimp. But I can't know for sure. as far as I know. As far as I know, last I checked. Yeah, but not in our area. So we do have, so a lot of you may have remembered in 2016, when it was obvious that this resource was being utilized by shrimp, and we have a small commercial harvest here. There's only a few families that do this, and it's pretty small in scale. Ghost shrimp are usually collected and harvested as bait for sturgeon. Sturgeon are actually one of the only other predators of ghost shrimp other than shorebirds. You have sturgeon that like to eat them, and then of course our gray whales. But yeah, that's not utilized here. The only aquaculture interest is the tribe has a aquaculture interest in shellfish harvest along their tidelands, but for the most part, there's not a whole lot of that aquaculture here. No. So, for instance, this pit here, they seem to be rotating the different sites. And now I say that whatever I say right now, don't quote me on in later years, because it seems like they're really changing their behavior. So, for instance, during our tagging effort last week, we were pretty much in the same location right off there in the Delta in Mission Beach for 4 days. So those whales, which is something we really hadn't seen in previous years, those whales were kind of staying in that location and really just feeding on that location. But since then, it seems like they shifted into feeding more towards Port Susan, Spivada, Tulalip shores in most recent days. So the whales, that's part of my thesis, and the focus of my work is trying to determine why a whale goes to this specific location and feeds there. Is it a function of prey density? Is it just that they can access that site because the tides are right? You know, we have very interesting tides here that shift pretty dramatically throughout the study season. So that's one of the things I'm hoping to figure out was.
From what you've seen of the weather in the particular area, but yes, how long?
I would say no more than a month. I would say maybe like give or take a week, depending on conditions. Because if we go back to this, yeah. If we go back to this, like I was pointing out here, you can see these are a couple, probably about 21 days or 2 weeks apart, and then you don't see these pits here and that. So I would guess about a month, but that's going to be the focus of coming years for me. I'm juggling multiple efforts and multiple objectives, and I'm just one person. But in next year's, what I'll do is probably post up on Mano Island and be able to go out and take pictures of the same pits throughout time and figure out how long. Yeah, so they have multiple brooding cycles, and that's something I kind of want to talk about here. So ghost shrimp have multiple brooding cycles, and we see pretty consistently brooding females throughout the study season. So they can breed in, I want to say April through October is when their brooding cycle typically is, but there's some interesting dynamics going on with it. You know, this is, in terms of ghost shrimp life history, this is very unique. This is it's the only reported place of them predating on ghost shrimp as far as I know. So there's probably some interesting things going on with population dynamics because they're not exposed to that kind of predation in other areas. So more recently, some of the things we've been trying to sort out is, are they only, like ultimately, what is gray whale predation doing to the ghost shrimp? And what I think is happening is that they're creating these pits, and because of the spacing of their baleen, they can retain these larger individuals, but some of the smaller ones, the more juvenile shrimp, escape and can recruit back. Ghost shrimp don't tend to naturally leave their burrows all that much or really move around. So So what we think, and one of the things we're really interested in, is looking at the recruitment of subadults to these feeding pits, and whether that's creating kind of a smoothing effect on the population. A couple of things that I wanted to talk about. DNR, of course, did a study in 2016 trying to estimate ghost shrimp stock abundance here in the Sound, which was when there was a big push to end the commercial harvest because of the competition between the whales. There is still the commercial harvest. They lifted the ban because they found that there were more than enough shrimp in the Sound for both the whales and for the harvestmen. But since then, I believe the number of sounders has nearly doubled. So that's why we're really trying to look at this on more of a higher resolution. So DNR just had one location that they sampled. I have now 4 different sites. I added one in Holmes Harbor and Mabana Shores this year. So really trying to get an idea of how many shrimp are in the area and whether that stock is still comparable to those abundances back in the Sound. So these are just some preliminary findings from last year. Again, I only had 2 sites. You can see that generally we see higher densities in Mission Beach. And that makes sense if you look at its proximity to the Delta and to the Snohomish Delta. Ghost shrimp tend to like to be closer to that freshwater input. And then, of course, we're looking at these subadult counts relative to where they are on the intertidal. Ghost shrimp literature tells us that the younger organisms tend to recruit further up shore, but we're finding a little bit less of that. We're actually, from last year's results, we're finding more subadults further offshore, and this could be a function of the gray whale predation and that kind of smoothing effect in the area. Some of the other things I'm looking at, ultimately I'll want to calculate biomass and extract that out to surrounding areas, and then with that paired with the estimates of the volume of the pits can be related back to the increases in body condition. Like I mentioned, this work is very physically taxing. You're out there often sinking up to your knees in the sediment. The private homeowner, Kevin Lundgren is his name, who owns this site and allows me access out there, lent me these snowshoes yesterday, which actually worked out quite well. You can see I'm quite stoked because I am now day 8 into a almost 10-day tagging and sampling effort, so I'm quite tired. But if you or anyone else that you know of is interested in helping or volunteering, this can include reporting, scouting whales. So I like to be able to go out and fly my drone over the whales so I can get really high precision points and locations, and then go back and feed and sample those feeding pits. If you're interested in helping out with sampling or documenting pit weathering, you can fill out this Google form here with the QR code. And that's all I have for today.
One quick update about
Oh, and I think there was a magnetic element in there that probably spelled out. No, thank you. Yep, that's it.
CGI?
Perfect. Fill the feed here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our presentation on YouTube. We're going to go ahead and cut the feed. Have a wonderful day.